Hello, Man in Gray here with another episode of Reading the 20th Century. This is a series in which I review a single book from every year of the 20th century, and this is episode number 3, and it's the year from 1903, and it's Jack London's classic adventure story set during the Yukon Gold Rush, The Call of the Wild. Before I talk to you about the book and about Jack London, here's a little information about the year 1903. A lot of things that happened that year that still affect us to this day. Following the Spanish American War, the country of Cuba agreed to lease Guantanamo Bay to the United States in perpetuity, and the United States still controls Guantanamo Bay to this day, the only part of Cuba that's still controlled by the United States. Um, there was in the United States a the Martha Washington Hotel opened. This became the first hotel opened exclusively for women. So it was a genre breaking business. And in Turkey, there was a massive earthquake in the city of Mazarkat, which killed over 3,000 people. In June of 1903, the Ford Motor Company began operating. Of course, they're still one of the major car manufacturers today, well over 100 years later. And in France, in July of 1903, the first Tour de France was held, the famous cross-country bicycle race, which is still one of the major sporting events. And then we had the very first World Series, first modern World Series held in 1903, where Boston defeated Pittsburgh for the World Series title. And the Crayola Crayon Company began selling boxes of crayons for 5 cents for the first time. And of course, they're still in business today. So a lot of things that started in 1903 still around today. Jack London was an author who was born in 1876 and died in 1916 at the age of 40. In his short life, crammed into his life a lot of adventure. He became one of the first really successful commercial writers writing for magazines. He primarily began writing serial stories in various popular magazines, and then later these stories were published in book form. And he's best known for his two novels set during the Yukon Gold Rush of the 1890s. London traveled to the Yukon in the 1890s, hoping to strike it rich. He didn't. He didn't find any money, but he was inspired by all the people there and the various activities of the miners to write The Call of the Wild and its sequel, White Fang. The Call of the Wild is basically a story about a dog, a pet, who becomes a wild dog. He's a half Saint Bernard and half collie who's owned in a suburb of San Francisco by a judge, and he's basically a pet. But when the gold is found in the Yukon, the judge's gardener kidnaps the dog and sells him to some gold miners to use as a sled dog. And the dog's named Buck. And the story is basically about Buck's transformation from a pampered pet to a fearless leader who later becomes the head of a wolf pack. And so it's a story of the wild nature underneath the surface. And in some ways, Call of the Wild is sort of like the Lord of the Flies, the famous story where a bunch of kids crash land on an island and revert to barbarism because civilization is left behind. In the same way, Buck leaves civilization behind when he becomes a sled dog. He goes through several owners who brutalize him and force him to become a sled dog owner. And he gradually realizes he has to change his ways in order to survive. And he becomes incredibly wild and free-spirited, and he develops a great independence, and he becomes the leader of a sled dog crew that a couple of people get him to do haul a sled dog around, and he becomes the leader of it. And eventually he escapes, though, and joins a wolf pack, and he becomes the leader of a wolf pack at the end. He's the alpha wolf of a wolf pack, and so he makes a complete transition from being a pampered pet dog to being this wild dog. And it's basically London was a socialist, a devoted socialist, and he uses these animal stories to kind of push his socialist agenda. The idea that capitalism exploits people, and they brutalize people and so forth. In fact, during the 1930s, The Call of the Wild was one of the books that was burned by the Nazis and banned by them. But that didn't keep it from becoming wildly popular. And it remains one of the popular books. And it was turned into a movie in the 1930s, starring Clark Gable, which wasn't very accurate, wasn't based much on the novel. But there was a remake done in the 1970s, which follows the plot of the novel a lot more closely. And so it's a adventure story. A lot of people think it's for kids, but it's really too dark, I think, for most kids. There's a lot of violence. There's several homicides, several murders. The dogs kill people. Dogs are beaten, so there's a lot of violence and blood and gore in some of it. And London certainly didn't intend it to be a kid's book, so it's always struck me as kind of odd. I think the kids' versions that you get are often censored, and so the more violent parts are left out. But it is a great adventure tale, and I think it's one that has still resonated with people. And London had a great ear for dialogue, and he had a great way of writing adventure scenes and action scenes, and he really understood the kind of characters who were attracted to the Canadian Gold Rush, the people that were willing to take chances and in incredibly cold weather, dangerous weather where the weather could kill you, but there was a chance to strike it rich, and people were willing to do that. And so, if you're interested in dogs and adventure stories, certainly The Call of the Wild is a book worth reading. The sequel, White Fang, is sort of reverse plot in which a wild dog becomes a domesticated dog. So it's basically the reverse, whereas Buck becomes this wild wolf pack leader, and in White Fang, a wild dog becomes a domesticated dog. So he took the story and turned it on its side, basically, in that way. And so that's basically the idea behind The Call of the Wild. I'll be back next week with a book dealing with 1904. And it's probably the shortest book that I'll be reviewing out of this whole series. It's a book called As a Man Thinketh by James Allen. And it's less than 100 pages long, but it's very influential because it was one of the first self-help books to be published. And it's basically about how the human mind works and how you can control your thoughts and can control your destiny by controlling your thought process. And it's been hugely influential. A lot of other self-help books have been inspired by As a Man Thinketh. So we'll deal with a classic self-help book from 1904 when we come back in next week's show. So that's it for this week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you once again next week.